Hi, Bruce.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good, thank you.
Good.
Nice to talk to you.
Thanks for taking the time. You are to be congratulated on your new book, America's Prophet, Moses and the American Story, which I'm holding up to the camera now. And you are, of course, in addition to being a veteran blogging head, which is, of course, probably your most prized honor, I would think, but in addition to that, you're the best-selling author of, for example, Walking the Bible, Abraham, Where God Was Born. So Moses is kind of a natural in that sequence, but in this case, you're moving away from the Middle East into America, and attributing to Moses no small significance in American history. In fact, I would say this almost makes parting the Red Sea look like a day at the beach. You write, one man is America's true founding father. His name is Moses. As is my duty, I'll probably give you a little pushback on your thesis. But first, do you want to kind of spell it out? Or say anything else?
Sure. I think I stumbled into this story. I had spent 10 years traveling around the Middle East, as you said, working on Walking the Bible, Abraham, Where God Was Born. There was a TV show of Walking the Bible. And I thought at that time that the kind of front line of this battle between religion and politics, God and war, was taking place in the Middle East. But when I started this book 4 or 5 years ago, that debate in a lot of ways had migrated back home. It actually comes up. It's sort of, in some ways, I wouldn't say the backdrop, but it's the context even for your book, The Evolution of God. We were kind of in the wake of 9/11 and the kind of backlash against the Bush presidency, and so suddenly we had kind of left, right, red, blue, fundamentalist, moderate, believer, non-believer. And so I suddenly thought, wow, this is interesting. I should think about this in the context of the state. So that's beat number one. Then, the time my wife had just given birth to identical twins, and we were sort of traveling around the U.S., and I sort of stumbled in to this story in a couple of places. Once we were in Plymouth, went on board, they had this recreation of the Mayflower. There's a reenactor reading the Bible, and I'm like, I'm Bible guy, so what are you reading? And he said, I'm reading the book of Exodus. We read it when we were crossing the Atlantic, and I thought, that's interesting. Here's Moses in the middle of the Thanksgiving story. In my childhood synagogue in Savannah, Georgia, I came upon this letter, which I had read but never really read, in which Washington, a few weeks after the presidency, says, credits his success in the revolution to that same wonder-working deity who long since freed the Israelites from Egypt. Okay, so here's Moses in the middle of the revolution. The Liberty Bell, we were visiting my sister in Philadelphia, has this quote from the 5 books of Moses: proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. And I kept looking around and seeing this story.
Yeah, which I had never realized is a biblical quote before reading your book.
It's from Leviticus 25:10, which is a kind of a under-discussed, Leviticus is the least loved book of the Bible. It's mostly filibuster. But in the middle of it is this holiness code which says, free the slaves, reunite the families, nurture the suffering, take the hurting into your arms. That's where the quote comes from. Actually, the quote is something of a mistranslation because that word deror is actually more commonly translated now as release. So, like, proclaim release throughout the world, meaning release your slaves. So one of the great things about the Liberty Bell, of its many misfortunes, is it didn't have to go through life as the release bell.
Right.
But all through, it became a big story in the showdown of the Civil War. Obviously, Martin Luther King, the night before he died, comparing himself to Moses. Reagan, Clinton, George W. Bush told me personally in the Oval Office he was inspired to run in part by this story. And of course, we know Obama has used it all through his candidacy and now even into his presidency. So I figured I would tell this story, and I think it is safe to say that this story was deeply influential all through American life for a whole bunch of reasons we can get into, but I do think that as a kind of metaphor, as a frame for what America is, which is coming out of oppression, going to a promised land, this tension between freedom and law, which has been present in American history from the time of the Pilgrims, the idea of building a kind of moral society that tends all of its people. These are ideas that were introduced into Western conversation in a lot of ways through passages of the Hebrew Bible and through a whole set of circumstances, the Reformation and the printing press and all this, became central to American identity.
Yeah. And, I should say, philosophically, I'm kind of naturally resistant to your thesis because, I'm something of a materialist. I generally think of kind of, political and social forces as being, if not determinative, very important. And I kind of think of social systems and forces within social systems kind of choosing the icons they need at the time. But I don't so much think of the icons themselves that are chosen as in turn exerting a lot of influence. So we can talk about this as we go on, but first I want to say that I was reminded of this as you went through your conception of the basic idea of the book, which is just that a couple of nights I sat down trying to skim through it to just get the main points, and I found that hard because everywhere I opened the book, there was something about American history that I hadn't known, very engagingly presented. So you made it. It's easy to get engrossed in, and I congratulate you on that. You're always a pleasure to read.
Well, you're kind. Let me just say. I hear I'm cutting off of a question there, but I will say that when I first had this idea, I kind of wondered if I could prove it, and I think. One thing that I kept finding was I was amazed at every turn how the story kept presenting itself. Certainly right. Moses. We can argue about. It sounds like you want to engage on, and I'm of course more than happy to engage on this issue of causality and right. Which comes first, the icon or the need for the icon or the fact that the icon. It is striking that whether you want the icon or need the icon, the same icon keeps passing up. I should just mention here at the outset, maybe the most startling and maybe even sexiest story in the whole book, leaving aside DeMille and Audrey Hepburn, is on July 4th, 1776. Immediately after passing the Declaration, the Continental Congress asked 3 people to right. propose a seal for the new United States. The 3 people were Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams. Mm-hmm. That's how important they thought it was. And 6 weeks later, they made their recommendation. The seal should be Moses leading the Israelites across the Red Sea. So these are 3 of the defining faces of the country, 3 of the 5 drafters of the Declaration. And to them, Moses should be the face of the United States.
Right. And then as I understand it, initially there was a 2-sided seal that included their conception on one side. On the other side was something more like what is familiar to us as that pyramid with the eyeball and the E pluribus unum?
Well, in the original design, there were 3 designs. The back was a herald, actually, showing the different colonies or the different states at that point, and this term E pluribus unum, which came from a magazine compendium, actually at the time. This was then tabled because of the Revolution. There was another commission 3 years later that also got tabled, and then by the time they got to the final seal in 1782, they were no longer in the moment of great exaltation of sort of standing up to the Pharaoh of King George, as Thomas mm-hmm. Paine called him. They were more trying to declare the permanency of the United States, and so they flipped from Moses to the pyramid. Now, of course, it doesn't take a Talmudic scholar to know that we're still in Egypt, but we've moved from Moses right. from the symbol of the Israelites to the symbol of the ancient Egyptians.
Right, and that's what people know. That's what we see today. Yeah, I was really. It made me think. You very convincingly show that references to and appeals to the Moses story have kind of pervaded American history, and I hadn't really thought about. And you make the case that in that sense, Moses is in a sense more important than Jesus. And I'm wondering if, I'll ask later if you've gotten any blowback from Christians on that. Right. But I had never really thought about it before. How Moses, in a way, does make more sense. Jesus is a fascinating figure, but in a certain sense, he's just not conventionally heroic. For one thing, right?
Well, I think let's talk about this Moses-Jesus thing because it's certainly where a lot of the chatter has inevitably fallen about the book, and I would say. So first of all, as you would say, let me state my case. And my case is that, of course, Jesus is important to American life. America was essentially 100% Christian at its founding. It's, depending on what survey you want to believe, 80% Christian today. But if you look at the themes of Jesus' life, love, poverty, charity, building a kingdom of heaven, These are ideas that would not make a list of defining traits of American public life. They are more important to Americans' private lives. And as one prominent Christian told me when I was engaging this in conversation, you can't be Jesus, right? That Jesus is an other type of figure in most of the Christian traditions. Whereas Moses is, first of all, besides being a much more human figure, he's got doubts, he's reticent, he's reluctant, he gets angry, and all these things that we know. That the thing about Jesus is, Moses is the themes of his life: standing up to authority, leading people out of oppression, dreaming of a promised land, turning a kind of wandering people into a nation of laws. These would be on a list of the defining American traits. So the issue is, in the great public transformation, my point is, in the great public transformations of American life, certainly, I mean, we're coming up on Thanksgiving here. When the Pilgrims got here in 1620, and you go back and you read what they were saying on the Mayflower, they weren't quoting Jesus, they were quoting Moses time and time again. And Jesus was so not important to the Pilgrims in many ways. They didn't even celebrate Christmas that first year because Christmas wasn't in the Bible. They were very, in their minds, I don't like to use this term, but Old Testament oriented. I prefer the term Hebrew Bible. But they were very Old Testament oriented. And again, when I came to see you, I was in Princeton doing research, as you recall, right. and we took a walk that afternoon, and I came across this study at the Princeton Theological Seminary, which is, of course, quoted in my book now, about these two academics set out in 1973 to read everything published in American history from 1765 to 1805. Everything published in the colonies. It ended up being 15,000 items. Their stated goal was to determine who was more important in the Revolution. The old debate, was it the Enlightenment writers or was it the classics? The first sentence of their study says, if we ask what book was most quoted during the Revolutionary era, the answer, somewhat surprisingly, in their words, is the book of Deuteronomy. That's, of course, the fifth of the 5 books of Moses. It's the one that recapitulates the story. So if American life has always been about this tension between kind of the secular strand and the religious strand, and we can move forward through the Civil War era, through the Civil Rights era, up to today, this story, time and again, people have gone back to because it is a story about nation building at its core, and that is not the main theme of the Jesus story.
No, liberation is not the main theme of the Jesus story. It may have been one thing on Jesus' actual political agenda, liberation from the Roman Empire, but it's not what we remember him for.
Well, but liberation, but even in the American story, liberation is only half of it. The other half of it is law, is responsibility.
Right, and although, I mean, the liberation part keeps coming in handy in keeping Moses in the American story. I mean, abolitionism, Statue of Liberty, and so on. But you're right. I mean, the other thing you did, I think that time that you were in Princeton was go talk to Michael Walzer, right?
And what Michael Walzer said to me was, and he wrote a book called Exodus and Revolution, which has some of these themes, which is a wonderful book. And in his proposition is that Moses doesn't just provide the template for revolution, that the Moses story introduces the idea of revolution into Western civilization. He actually goes much further. And I think that this, by the way, I think is a good moment to address the other important factor here, which is that the relationship between this story and nation building, if you were, was not relatively, just de facto new with the United States, because a couple of things happened. So the Moses story would have taken place 3,200 years ago in ancient Egypt. It then was written down 2,500 years ago, 500 years before the birth of Jesus, and then was actually largely pushed aside. So Jews tended to downplay the story in favor of God. The Passover story, which celebrates the Israelites coming out of slavery, Moses isn't even mentioned. Christians, of course, downplayed Moses in terms in favor of Jesus. In fact, there's a moment, a passing of the torch, if you will, between Moses and Jesus. Muslims, of course, downplay him in favor of Muhammad. And all through the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church, you were not allowed to read the Bible directly. The priest had to do it for you in Latin, and there had to be an intermediary. And so a couple things happened before, right in the sort of antechamber to the founding of America. Number one, you had the Reformation. So for the first time, the church was saying, read the Bible. In fact, we'll give it to you in your own language. Here's in your vernacular, so you can encounter it. Second, the printing press. In the Middle Ages, it took 2 months, 4 years to transcribe a Bible. There just weren't even that many Bibles. Even that many churches didn't have them.
Right.
So for the first time you had them, people could read the story. And so then there was the geography. So if you're, say, the Pilgrims, you're first in England, then you're in the Netherlands, you're feeling oppressed. What do? You cross a tumultuous sea, you go to an untested wilderness, you try to create this utopian land of milk and honey. They found themselves in the story, and as Peter Gomes said to me, they weren't trying to recreate it. In effect, they were trying to fulfill it. Because to them, it was the Old Testament, if you will, was a prophecy that so many of these early people were trying to fulfill. They don't, because the last thing I'll say is, before you jump back in here, is there wasn't this distance between them and the Bible that we have now. I mean, almost everybody in 1800 believed it was true. And imagine the slaves, right? So, they don't get their news from the newspaper. They got it from the Bible, and they look and say, oh, look, who's the only force higher than my master, than the state around me that supports slavery? Answer, God. And here's God's word, so it gives me some sense of hope that there is a rival narrative to the reality that I live under, in fact, every day.
Mm-hmm. Now, are you suggesting that the Pilgrims might not have summoned the energy to come to America had it not been for the Moses story?
What I'm saying is that you need to, what somebody said to me when I was talking about this time in history is that they were looking for precedent, right? They're looking for something that gives them some authority. And, okay, so they're standing up. The Pilgrims, of course, are radical Protestants. So you already have the Reformation, and that they call King James the Pharaoh in Plymouth Plantation. You see it there. So they need another authority. So they have to say, my authority is God. And for them, God was, the way they communicated with God primarily was through the text. And they had Geneva Bibles. When they were on the Mayflower, they were carrying Geneva Bibles. Geneva Bibles actually on the title page were emblazoned with an image of Moses leading the Israelites across the Red Sea. So for us it may be metaphor, but for them it was precedent. It was a real alternative for what they faced every day.
Okay. And I'm curious, have you gotten much blowback on the Moses versus Jesus question? Of course, Christians are big fans of Moses, but some of them may have thought of Jesus as the number one guy. Have you caught any flack yet? I mean, your book hasn't been out that long.
Yeah, it hasn't been out that long. There was a big cover story about me in USA Today Life that began with the sentence, he says it flat out, Moses is bigger than Jesus, and that line, certainly has caught a lot of flack. And if you read the comments, or I don't know if internet comments are a gauge of anything other than internet comments. But yeah, sure. I mean, I think that people, in general, I would say that the thesis is a radical thesis for people. I would say that the idea of linking Moses and America in general is a radical thesis, and I would say that the idea that Moses is more important to Americans than Jesus is a radical thesis. I would say certainly of the reviews and comments and things like that, people are saying, I was surprised. I was uncomfortable. He proves the case. I'm not sure, what to do with it. But I would say I've gotten certainly a lot of hate mail and things like that. But I would say at the moment that no one has touched the central thesis, and the nature of what I do is I travel, right? Walking the Bible. The idea is I go to the places. So as you know, in the book, I sit down with Christians, professors, academics, religious leaders, and everybody involved in the story, and kind of put it to them. I mean, there's a moment, there's a wonderful moment that I had with Alan Guelzo and at Gettysburg, in which we talked about the fact that one of the fascinating things is that about the story is that when Washington died in 1799, 2/3 of the sermons compared George Washington to Moses. They both led the people out of slavery, and yet they both handed down the law. And there's a great parallel there. And more interestingly, in a lot of ways, when Lincoln died, even though Lincoln was assassinated shot on Good Friday, died on Saturday, was eulogized on Easter Sunday, if you go sermon by sermon of the ones that remain, and you did it, and I did the math on my desk here, more of the sermons compared Lincoln to Moses than compared him to Jesus, because, of course, he liberated the slaves, like Moses dying on Mount Nebo, not making it to the Promised Land. Lincoln, of course, dies on the eve of the victory of the war. And so I said to Alan Guelzo, who has written one of the great books about, he's won 2 Lincoln Prizes, and he won a wonderful biography about Lincoln as an idea person. And I said, well, if you were given the choice, what would you do? Would you compare Lincoln to Moses or compare him to Jesus? And we just had this wonderful kind of back and forth about it, and he said, it really depends on what you knew. If you knew Lincoln as a private person, he said, I think he was more interested in themes of Jesus' life, but as a public person, I do think it's fair to say he was more like Moses. So it's not just me saying it, it's actually an entire conversation that goes through, and certainly King, I think it's pretty... The argument is not hard to make at all with Martin Luther King.
No, that's of course, what I'm going to send you the hate mail for is saying that he was more important than Darwin. I'm not hung up on the Jesus issue so much. The sentence is, while certain intellectuals might have had a greater impact on particular periods of American life, no single thinker has had more sustained influence on American history over a longer period than Moses, and that includes Plato, Aristotle, Locke, Hobbes, Montesquieu, Marx, Darwin. That's the part that hurts. Freud and Einstein.
We should say, just before you go to this, I have to say, in general, for the record, you're not a Moses lover. You and I had this conversation. I interviewed you at the 92nd Street Y a month back, and in The Evolution of God, there's no Moses love. I think Moses, there's not a lot of Jesus love either. But there's absolutely...
There's not a lot of love in that book.
Well, there's not a lot of love.
Until the very end, when I encourage everyone to love everyone.
Yes, exactly. There's love for Philo.
I love Philo. His name means love.
There's love for people you've never heard of. Anybody you've heard of, there's no love. People you haven't heard of, there's love. Okay.
They've gotten enough good press.
But and I think I asked you in that conversation, and any props for Moses? You're not interested in Moses personally.
Well, what I said was, my book was trying to reconstruct, stuff that actually happened, and Moses is shrouded in the mists of oral history, I would say, more than the people I tried to focus on.
Yes.
But that has nothing to do with your thesis, I would say, because it's not the historicity of the Moses story that matters to you, but...
Right.
But
yeah, exactly. I wrote about that in Walking the Bible.
History.
So let's so back to where we were with Darwin. So then we have an issue of how are you going... Then it's back to the semantic issue I said before. How are you going to define influence? If you're going to say, Darwin is not exactly a beloved... no one's going to put Darwin on a seal. No one's going to quote Darwin. I'm not sure I've ever heard anybody quote Darwin, who's not an academic. People may be influenced by the idea. The idea may seep through everything from secularism to science to biology, even to computer science or whatever you want to say. That is a different idea than what I'm talking about, of saying that this figure, his life, becomes a model for how people live their lives. Obviously, Einstein, it's not hard to say that more people on a daily basis are influenced by ideas that came from them. But that is different from saying, I want to be Einstein, and I'm going to march in the streets of Selma and look down fire hoses saying, oh, I'm here because I believe that my materialistic matter is equal to your materialistic matter. That's not what's getting people. That's not what they're singing in the street. They're not singing EMC Square. They're thinking we should, go down Moses.
Right. No, I think your toughest case is Jesus, and even there, I would concede that Moses, along a certain dimension, is clearly king. He best fits the American story, and I think you're right. He's a more natural role model for anyone who wants to step forward and kind of do something. Because the Jesus story is like, it's all about the death, and nobody especially wants to die. On the other hand, I would say that there are different avenues of influence. And so, for example, what would you say about the sheer power of singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic during the Civil War? Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. I think that's kind of not what you're talking about so much, that sort of inspiration. And that's
well,
not
I am,
the case
actually,
of anyone
because,
using Jesus as role model or saying he embodies the American story, but it must have gotten people fired up, right?
Sure, but if we're going to go to music, I think the case is Moses is going to take this hands
You think
down.
Moses wins the music sweepstakes?
You look at the role of slave spirituals, okay, and you go down spiritual by spiritual, as I have done, and of many more. Take back all Pharaoh's armies, Sweet Canaan, go down Moses, which was called the national anthem of slaves. And what was happening with these spirituals was that they were sending coded messages, okay? So that, remember, it's easy to forget, the slaves, the Africans, when they got here, they weren't Christians, right? They had their own traditions. Some of them were Muslim. And the Christians imposed Christianity on them. It was a way of exerting control, which, by the way, Christianity has done a lot, as we know, throughout history. And Frederick Douglass writes, when he and his fellow slaves were swinging, Sweet Canaan, I'm bound for the land of Canaan, the white overseers were saying, yes, we taught them our religion. They're just like us. In fact, they were using it to send secret messages, like there's a conductor coming on the Underground Railroad, or we're going to go this route and turn left at the tree and turn right at the creek. And Harriet Tubman, of course, who did this most of all, if you read her autobiography, and she talks about when she was leaving from Maryland, she said, she was led by a pillar of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night, of course, exactly what the Israelites were led, and through slavery, and she gets to freedom, and then she goes back and makes, we don't know how many, between, say, 14 and 20 trips back to the region, and she became so famous she had to adopt an alias. She chose the alias Moses, and there were these wanted posters put up across the South saying, wanted Moses, dead or alive. So here, 50 years earlier, they wanted Moses to be on the seal, and now Southerners wanted him locked back up in shackles. And so, again, if you're doing that, so I think that the role of these spirituals for slaves and indirectly through abolitionists was as powerful, if not more powerful, than the Battle Hymn of Republic, which is what about facing death, and it's back to the idea of death, right?
Yeah.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of. I mean, it's all about. So I'm not trying to say that Jesus isn't more important, but I'm trying to say that Jesus is more of a private figure that you can't emulate. Whereas Moses, as you said, he kind of evangelizes action. He justifies taking risk, and my wife, as you know, runs this nonprofit called Endeavor that supports entrepreneurs. And when we were talking about Moses every night for 4 years, I mean, she was sort of saying this is the spirit of Silicon Valley, that this is the idea of standing up. If you're Bill Gates standing up to IBM, you're a Moses-like figure. And then, of course, what happened? Gates himself became the Pharaoh, and Steve Jobs became the Moses figure. Then Google, it was repeated. So there's this idea of there is a big, powerful institution, but I can do it better than them and lead people even farther into a better world. That's incredibly Mosaic. And I mean, at this point, it's really hard to separate Moses, I think, from so many of the ideas of the American dream. And
okay, well, what if we take the Jesus-Moses face-off to Superman? You have a really great riff on Superman and Moses. Now, I was brought up Christian, so when I encounter the Superman story, I think Savior of the world. Got to be Jesus, Savior of all humanity, which of course was Jesus' mission according to most of the New Testament. And further, you point out something that the name of Jesus and his father both have. The name of Superman and his father both have as their last syllable El, which is Hebrew for God. Well, I would say Father is God, Son is God. I know who comes to mind for me, but you've got a different interpretation.
Let's go back in the story. I think that after the Civil War, the Bible begins to decline in influence in America, as we know, right? So that the secular rhetoric begins to take over. Fundamentalism, in a lot of ways, is a response to what happens around that time. You've got Darwin, you've got higher criticism, you've got the rise of science in general, and the idea that there is, JP, these different voices in the Bible, which is a big part of your book. But what's interesting is that Jesus, to a certain extent, but as much, if not more, Moses kind of decouples himself from the Bible and kind of enters the realm of popular culture. So some of the earliest films ever made back in the 1900s were made about Moses. DeMille, of course, makes a 1923 Moses.
Wait, DeMille made both of those movies?
He made the 1923 silent film Moses.
Right.
And there's a great story. He shot it in California,
okay.
and he decided that for the Exodus, he flew in. I know what that means. Planes hadn't been around that long. He chartered a plane and flew Hasidic Jews from New York to California because he thought they'd be most realistic as the Israelites walking across the desert at that time. And he got them out of the desert. He brings them out into the baking sun, puts them in the mess tent, and the first night serves them ham. For dinner.
This was before he discovered that his grandfather was Jewish or his father or whatever.
Well, it's the mother, but who was Jewish, and and I talked to his granddaughter about that, and the father was kind of a lay Episcopalian priest and used to read in the Bible every night.
Right.
And he later made King of Kings, so he made a Jesus movie, but then he goes back in the Cold War. And, we should probably talk about that in a bit, and sort of makes Moses in the 56 Ten Commandments into an icon for the Cold War. But before that, you've got the comic book era. And as we know, essentially comic books, in large measure, were, if not invented, then certainly pioneered or taken over by Jews. And so many Spider-Man and right down the line, 20 of these characters all came from Jews, because Jews were sort of, at that moment in time, largely outside the mainstream of culture. They were just beginning to take over in Hollywood at that time. So Superman was invented in 1938 by two bookish Jews from Cleveland, Ohio. They were influenced by science fiction, by Greek mythology, lots of different things, but the backstory taken, in fact, point by point, from the Hebrew Bible. So just as Moses is put into a basket, floated down the Nile to escape annihilation, Superman put into a basket, floated into space to avoid a planet facing extinction. Both people picked up by aliens, raised by surrogate parents in an alien environment, and then summoned to assist humanity. And yes, indeed. So and Superman's original name in Kryptonian was Kal-El. That El is, as you said, the Elohim in the Bible. That's the El in Israel. So Israel means wrestling with God, as you know. Kal-El means swift God. So he was clearly designed. And what's interesting is that you may not have known it when you first encountered this book, encountered the Superman story, but Hitler certainly knew it, and Hitler went railing against Superman as being written by circumcised chaps and Jews, and as a kind of symbol of America, and poor Americans were being fed this Jewish story, and they didn't even realize it. And then Superman does. I mean, why? I mean, I went to see this guy, Simcha Weinstein, in my book, as you know, who lives not far from me. And he wrote this book called Up and Oy Vey about the Jews in comic books. And the idea here is that for Jews feeling alienated, outsiders, having to adopt certain costumes to go into society, like Clark Kent and Superman, that kind of division. But Superman then goes and fights these battles that weakened, ghettoized Jews don't feel that they can. So he goes, and in the Superman 2, Superman 4, whatever the numbers are, goes and Lois Lane goes to kind of a thinly disguised Germany, fights this Adolphus Runyon, I think is his name, which is clearly Adolf Hitler. So the Jewish contemporary story is all through those early Supermans. And I think that beyond it's interesting, kind of the son of the father, I hadn't really thought about that in terms of Jesus, but I think clearly Jewish influence drips all over the story.
Yeah, and against the theory that he's a Jesus figure is the fact that the people who thought him up weren't Christians, I guess. It's interesting. I mean, it says something, I think, about how well the Nazis understood propaganda, that they found the Superman figure threatening. I mean, they not only they wouldn't have had to be Einstein to see that he was being used against them, but also they understood that a mere comic book figure can be very influential, which a lot of politicians might not have.
The numbers are astonishing, Bob. I mean, it's something like 25% of Americans had a comic book of the soldiers during World War II in their back pocket. I mean, the numbers I mean, think about them. They're cheap. They're easy to ship. They're very portable. Comic books were a huge part of World War II.
Now that's interesting to think that that Superman maybe directly inspired troops. On that front, in terms of the deployment of Moses symbolism and iconography in the name of America's kind of foreign policy agenda, I had forgotten that DeMille, as you remind us, with the Ten Commandments, his second making of the Moses story, he actually comes on stage and gives a little speech at the beginning of the movie, right? Now, how explicit is he in enlisting Moses in the Cold War?
He's very explicit. I mean, first of all, this is not shown on TV today, so most people don't remember. When you would see the movie in 1956, the curtain would part, and there was DeMille standing there in a suit and tie. This is a 3-hour and 39-minute movie, and he feels the need to have this 5-minute preamble in which he said the theme of this movie is if you live in a dictatorship, you can't worship God freely, and if you live in a free society, you can worship under God's law. Now, DeMille was always a conservative in a town of liberals, and so he was always a little bit ostracized, and he wanted to remake the movie, and they didn't want to, and it was Adolf Zucker, who was his kind of longtime rival, who finally said, oh, it takes a Gentile here to remind us. And he chose to remake the Ten Commandments in 1956 and not King of Kings, the Jesus story, because he wants to recruit Moses as an icon for the Cold War. And so he stands up and he makes this statement at the beginning, like, this is what the movie is about. And then all through he casts basically Americans as the Israelites and Europeans as the Egyptians.
So do the Egyptians have what kinds of accents do they?
Well, yeah, Yul Brynner. You've got lots of people like that, sort of making them seem a little kind of dark and hostile and indirect way. The one person who knew this wasn't true was Anne Baxter, and she was Heston's love interest. Now, of course, he adds this whole love story, right? He sexed the whole thing up. In fact, I think it was the New Republic that called it Sexodus when the movie came out, and I alluded to it earlier. One of the things I did was the DeMille estate gave me access to his papers that no one's ever gotten before, and he actually auditioned Audrey Hepburn to play Moses' love interest, but found her breast too small, so gave the part to Anne Baxter. So she's American, so that the hero can't have a kind of foreign-born love interest in
Did he actually record in his papers that he found her breast too small?
He recorded in his papers that he had his secretary type in black and red ink. And those are the days when you had to shift the ribbon, that he found her breast too small, so she wasn't voluptuous.
That's something I would have just left as a thought.
Well, maybe that's why I don't know if your personal diaries are going to be published. She didn't like Heston.
I doubt there will be a lot of demand for them. I doubt there will be journalists like you begging for permission.
He didn't like Heston either. I mean, he writes in his notes. I mean, he's very dour. Find out if he's got a sense of humor. Everything I've seen him in, he's too serious. And so this politics even enters the play. So he does 3 plays. He does Turning the Nile into Blood, which he uses a garden hose and red dyed water. He uses for the hail, he uses not mothballs, which is everybody guesses, but popcorn, because it's easier to sweep up. And for the 10th play, The Killing of the Firstborns, this had always been, kind of the man with the sickle, the kind of shadow of death. That's not scary enough. What's the scariest thing in 1956 America? Answer, nuclear war. This is the duck and cover age. So he uses a green fog that comes over the horizon and seeps under the door, because this sort of will represent nuclear war. And at the end of the movie, Heston hands over the Book of Life to Joshua, his successor, walks up Mount Nebo, quotes, "The Liberty Bell, proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof," even though that quote is from Leviticus 3 books earlier, nowhere near Moses' death in the end of Deuteronomy, climbs to the top of the mountain, and then recreates the pose of the Statue of Liberty, which, we've alluded to it, is also modeled on Moses, the spikes around her hair, the tablet in her arms. And it's all, I have this book of his notes, it's all in his notes. It's very purposeful. He marches Moses through the icons of American history until he becomes this embodiment of America enlightening the world. And then the last thing he does, the most political thing he does, is he gets Paramount to make 4,000 stone replicas of the Ten Commandments, which he places on courthouses around the country. He dispatches Heston and Yul-Brynner to dedicate them, and one of those, on the grounds of the State House in Texas, it becomes the basis for the 2005 Supreme Court case that says you can have 10 commandments if they have a secular intent, but you can't if it's really religious. So this publicity stunt for Paramount becomes the basis for landmark U.S. law.
Wow. There's one thing we kind of alluded to. I don't know how deeply we got into it, though, earlier in the conversation. I'm wondering if you wanted to say any more about it, and that is this kind of tension between freedom and law.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, what figures in this, in your mind, is the covenant, right? For the people of Israel.
For the law part, I mean, I think that if you look at the story, right? So Moses, born in slavery, murders the overseer, goes off. Here's God in the burning bush, comes back. Plagues follow. Let my people go. They walk across the Red Sea. This should be a moment of great exhilaration, right? They've left slavery. They've gone into freedom. What happens? This period of lawlessness and chaos. There's not enough food to eat. There's not enough water to drink. I think there's this great moment in the Bible that is incredibly parallel to the birther moment, where they literally say, "Who elected you over us?" I mean, they don't ask for his birth certificate, but they come right up there because there are these parallels. Both Obama and Moses, for example, unusual upbringings, raised by grandparents. Kind of exactly are they part of this culture, or part of that culture? So that there's this period of lawlessness ensues. The result is the Ten Commandments. So the idea is that freedom must be balanced by law, liberty with responsibility. And that, again, a huge part. So when the Pilgrims get here, they've escaped oppression, but what do? They impose basically Old Testament laws you could be thrown into the prison for taking God's name in vain or for not respecting your parents. I mean, the use of these laws in very early America was pretty widespread. And this is what happened in the Revolutionary era, right? So you have the great moment of freeing from the Revolution. Period of lawlessness we know follows in the 1780s, followed by the Constitutional Convention. And it's because one person presides over both. Washington, like Moses, leads the Americans to freedom, and then comes and presides over the Constitutional Convention. That sets up the idea that when he dies, so many of the eulogies, the 350 eulogies that remain, 2/3 of them compare Washington to Moses, because both were these leaders. They resisted turning the country into monarchies. They were not good speakers, but they left behind quoted phrases. So, one of the things that Walter said to me when I was in Princeton that day was that the biblical term for getting those laws on Mount Sinai, it's the same slavery idea. In other words, there's a moment of re-enslavement under God's law. So here they were involuntary slaves in Egypt. Now they are voluntary slaves to God's law. So that idea of the covenant goes all the way through. Bill Clinton, even in 1992, we're going to make a new covenant. Mm-hmm. So this idea of the covenant enters America, and there is this tension. And that's what you see in the Statue of Liberty. At the feet of the statue, you've got broken shackles. You never see them because we're always usually looking at it from below. And then the tablet in her arms. That was not, and when Bartholdi, the sculptor, when he picked the Roman goddess, she used to carry a jug. She was not carrying a tablet. And even the spikes were not often there. The spikes are introduced from this moment Moses comes down Sinai with the tablets, and then there are the tablets. So there is this kind of tension there, as you rightly say, between freedom and law, which is still central to American identity.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's a different kind of tension that I think you acknowledge in the book. And here you acknowledge, I think, that the story can be put both to uses you would approve of and uses you don't. I think you say early in the book that the story is in some ways kind of anti-American exceptionalism, and I immediately thought, well, yes, but you could also certainly use the story to gain a sense of entitlement, given the fact that these are the chosen people. And I was reminded specifically of the doctrine of manifest destiny, which in American history was used to justify conquering the West, including, killing no few Indians, I guess. And I thought, you could certainly draw on the Bible for inspiration there, since after all, the Israelites, upon entering the Promised Land, killed no few native inhabitants. So, and I think, you kind of deal with this, but it is. It's something you acknowledge, right?
Well, I think it's there. I mean, I think for sure it's there, and I think the certainly there was a lot of violence that the Pilgrims executed or set forth, if you will, toward the Indians around them. But they were mostly a small and vulnerable people, and as power got accrued in American life, sure, American exceptionalism only grew. As for Manifest Destiny, Moses was no small part of that. I mean, because you had the same thing. You were going across, in this case, mountains, Appalachians, Alleghenies, and going into the West and going into an untested wilderness. There was a big religious dimension to that. I mean, a lot of Lyman Beecher, when he went from Connecticut out to Ohio, it was because he wanted the Protestants to get there before the Catholics took it over, because that battle was entering America in the mid-19th century. But they definitely used a lot of Moses language. You can really see the Daniel Boone story, where the person who more or less took this real trader and added all this mythology used a lot of Moses language, and he used it basically as a recruiting tool, because he was coming back into Pennsylvania and trying to get people to come into the West. So the idea of recreating this element, and of course we know the Mormons used that story for sure when they went from the Midwest then to the Far West later in the 19th century. So that story, but already you're beginning to see. Melville says, the Ark of Liberties, Americans' job it is to spread the Ark of Liberties around the world. That's not really in the Pilgrim back in the founding era, because they don't have the ability to spread this around the world. You see it in Manifest Destiny, and certainly Bush, and some of the later wars. There was a lot of religious rhetoric in the idea of the Bush Doctrine, and the idea of it is our God-given responsibility to send American freedom around. And certainly in the Iraq War, and I wrote about this in Where God Was Born, where you're back to the Garden of Eden, you're back to the birthplace of the idea of biblical. We're all created in God's image, and we have these certain notions of God-given freedom, and it is our God obligation almost. I mean, I think that when as the story of that war it continues to unfold, I think the religious rhetoric, because the other thing was Babylon. Of course, Babylon was there in Iraq, and it was destroyed. So that is, yes, it has definitely been used as a justification for either chosenness or responsibility, or we are the cradle of this notion of freedom, and then we have to either spread it or in some cases impose it on other people. But that doesn't. But having said that, I don't think that's the primary way in which it's been used. I think more often it's been used to what is, I think, a bigger part of the story, which is from the opening passage of Exodus, when God hears his people moaning under slavery, from Moses when he sees this Israelite being beaten by the overseer. Remember, he's living in the palace. He's got a pretty luxurious world. He chooses to align himself with that suffering. So time and again, even the burning bush, God says, I hear the plight of my people. So I think that the bigger theme of the story is build a society that nurtures all of its people. And as I was saying earlier, the Liberty Bell, take the suffering into your arms, uplift the hurting, and tend to the poor. And that is a bigger idea in the story. And I think it's a bigger use throughout American history than the exceptionalism, which is certainly there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, as we approach the end of our allotted time, I think we've touched on a lot of the highlights. One thing we touched on only briefly is the civil rights movement.
Yes.
Of course, the obvious part of it is the famous King's Speech. But there are. I mean, what did you find that maybe you didn't even know going in?
Well, I think that King used the story a lot. So not only in his first national speech, actually, in 1956, in May 1956, at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City, the Montgomery bus boycott was still going on at that time. He stood up and said, compared obviously the Israelites, and he used it actually not just for the civil rights movement, but it was part of the whole kind of anti-colonial movement that was going on around the world. He linked it to that from the very beginning. He actually called the Supreme Court Moses for parting the Red Sea of segregation, and he uses it a lot. And I went to Memphis and I stood in that spot at the bottom of that bowl, the Mason Temple. It's not a Masonic temple, it's a Mason temple, which I didn't realize. And he's not up on a high podium, he's on the bottom of this thing, and the seats go up around him. And he gives the speech. I've been to the mountaintop, I've looked over, I've seen the Promised Land. I will not make it there, but I know you as a people will make it there without me. And I went and I sat with Andy Young, and I said, Ambassador Young, I mean, it's not hard for me to come up with a question, but I can't come up with a question. This is unbelievable. He was on the cover of all these magazines as the American Moses. Here he uses the story. What Andy Young said to me was that he often went to this dark place. Obviously, he'd been, attempted assassinations his whole public life. But he usually snapped himself out of it. He usually kind of went humorous, kind of dark humor. And this night he didn't snap himself out of it. And I would say the thing that I took away from that I think was a surprise of this whole journey, looking at Moses as and his role in American history, to me, was that basically the story in a lot of ways is a failure narrative, right? Moses doesn't make it into the Promised Land. Mm-hmm. So why has it been every generation? Because every generation needs it, because it doesn't work. So the pilgrims don't build this land of milk and honey when they are in, and William Bradford start studying Hebrew and writing mournful poems about Moses. So then you've got the revolution is a success, but you've got to have the Constitution. The Constitution is a success. But then you've got slavery. The Civil War is a success. Then you've got Jim Crow. The Civil Rights Movement is a success. Then you've got a backslide. Now you've got Barack Obama, who stands up in Selma 3 weeks after announcing for the presidency and says, the Civil Rights generation is the Moses generation, but remember, Joshua still had a job to do, cross the river. I'm going to be the head of the Joshua generation, finally take us across the river. So you have that great Mosaic moment of the election of Barack Obama. Now, we're less than a year into his presidency. What's happening? He's got an entrenched Pharaonic establishment on one hand and rebellions from his own stiff-necked people on the other. I just had this piece in Time, as you know, and what Obama can learn from Moses. And this, number one is, guess what? You're not Joshua. You're Moses all over again. And by the way, prepare for failure, because that is part of what's going to happen to you, as what's happened to every Mosaic figure through history. And I think the ultimate lesson then of the story is it's not the leader's role to make it into the Promised Land. It's his role to prepare us to make it without him.
Well, that's kind of inspiring, actually.
It is inspiring, Bob. I mean, materialism has its limits. People need,
It has its limits. Every once in a while, we need you to show up and get us revved up.
It's sort of, a dream. Imagine sell the milk and honey. It was one of my lessons for Obama. Enough of the law. You gotta recapture that voice. You gotta create that dream. You gotta remind people that there is a better world. You've got to remember that the story at its core is a narrative of hope. This year, as it says in the Passover service, this year we are slaves, but next year we can be free. Okay.
So you bring us a message of hope. Well, you can't beat that. I want to show them the book again and say again that there's a ton of fascinating stuff in this that you didn't know. I mean, everything you know about the Liberty Bell is wrong, just to take one example. Yeah, everything you think you know about the Liberty Bell turns out to be wrong. And I also want to say, you said that you thought Moses wins the Moses-Jesus face-off in the realm of 19th century music. I was thinking in modern sports, how are we going to play this? You got in basketball, you got Moses Malone.
Yes, in fact, there was a line. You Moses. There was a whole thing about Moses will take us into the Promised Land, the 76ers.
Right. There was. He was on that, right. Was that on the cover of Sports Illustrated?
I think it was,
yeah. On the other hand, in baseball, you've got how many guys named Jesus, Bruce?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because they're not that many.
Jesus Alou from my day.
I haven't thought of, but I typed it in. I went to that Social Security website and I typed in Moses Jesus. 100 years ago, when the Social Security Administration kept keeping records, which was the 30s, but I think that the names go back even further. They were relatively equal, actually. And then Jesus went through a huge boom, and Moses went through a bust. In the last 5 years, the arrows have been pointed. I mean, I'm trying to get on the camera here. The Jesus arrow has been coming down, and I don't know why this is, because you would think with Hispanics that would be up.
Right.
I personally wonder if there's a kind of a Bush backlash, a kind of backlash against
I think it's a strictly Hispanic thing, right? I mean,
But why would the number be going down in the last 5 years? Is it because the second generation Hispanics don't want?
I don't know whether they're getting more creative with their names or what, but I think the phenomenon has pretty much always been confined to Hispanics, right? I mean, otherwise you don't find it's like naming a kid God. I think from the point of view of a lot of Christians.
But Moses has been on the upswing, and I don't exactly know why. I mean, it could be that Old Testament names and the kind of back to the Old Testament movement we see in Christianity is up, or I'd be very curious to see with Obama this whole Moses Joshua thing, where the language is kind of much more on his lips, whether it will be an uptick. Maybe African Americans will go back to the story, but Moses is definitely on the rise, and Jesus is definitely on the decline. At least.
Well, a writer that you and I both know, and who's going to come out with a book on the Sabbath, named her kid Moses, and I said, "Wow, that's a lot of pressure, man." I'm not sure I'd do that to a kid.
Well, I think your daughter Darwin, she's handled it well.
Darwina. My son is named Darwin. Well, listen, Bruce, thanks a lot. It's really a great book, and I think you're already having success with it. But I'll let you get back to your hectic book tour, and we appreciate you taking the time for this.
Thanks, Bob. Always good to be with you.
Okay. See you around.